Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to panel 6. This is the first session of the Transport and Mobility panel, the first of 4 sessions. Today, we're talking about the very topical subject of teleworking and smart measures to reduce transport demand. Very topical, obviously, in the wake of the pandemic that we've just been or still immersed in. I'm Neil Wallace. I'm a consultant specializing in transport, energy and climate with a particular emphasis on communications. Recently, my main role has been with an organization called Zemo Partnership, which was formerly Low CVP, the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership. I've also worked for the Energy Saving Trust and the Renewable Energy Consumer Code, which is part of the Renewable Energy Association here in the UK, and a range of other organizations. I'm co-hosting this session from my eco shed, which is quite near Oxford in the UK. It's a lovely Mediterranean type day here. Really very nice indeed. It's been great working with my co-panel leader, Dražen Vihovski, who is based and co-hosting from his place in Croatia. So Dražen, perhaps you'd like to say just a few words of introduction.
Thank you, Neil. A warm welcome from Zagreb, Croatia. I'm Dražen Vrhovski, and I work as a transport consultant and managing director of a local consultancy, focusing more on the tech side of transport improvement projects rather than on policy issues and strategies. This is my first time at eceee Tripoli, and as such, I strongly suspect that some of you have more experience than me in running events like the one today. Having said that, I hope I will meet your expectations and be a good co-host. And so let's all have a nice and relaxing chat on issues having to do with smart measures to reduce transport demand. Over to you, Neil.
Lovely. Thanks, Dražen. So, on to our presenters. We've got 4 presentations similar with to other panel sessions you might have attended. So 15 minutes of presentation, about 5 minutes of questions, and then at the end we hope to have about 10 minutes where we can have a group discussion. So please, all of you out there, please post your questions in the chat, either on Zoom or on Hoover, and we'll gather them together and pose them to the presenters. So without too much more ado, I'm going to introduce Francesca, and I'd like to thank Dražen for pulling together some great biogs for me. Thanks Dražen. So Francesca is a senior researcher from the RSE, which is an energy research institute in Milan in Italy. She graduated in energy engineering and currently works in the energy efficiency research group of the Energy Systems Development Department of RSE. And over the years, she's analysed the issue of energy consumption in the civil, residential, public and private and tertiary sectors, with particular focus on heat pumps, cogeneration systems and sustainable mobility. So Francesca, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, I'm Francesca Bazzocchi. I work in RSE, Research on Energetic System. This is a public company who carry on research in the electric field and the strategic national plan. The work that I present today is about sustainable mobility and in particular the role of smart working in the mobility scenario in larger cities. The objective of the study is to analyze mobility demand during COVID lockdown, focusing the attention on the role and impact of smart working. We divided the study into phases. The first one, we analyzed the demand for mobility during COVID lockdown compared to the previous situation. In the second phase, we analyzed the effect of smart working on Milan urban mobility and environmental benefits. Why did we choose Milan? Milan is the second most populated Italian city, and during a normal working day, it accounts for 3.8 million people moving in the area. For this reason, it is one of the most important transport nodes in Italy. Also, this is not our first analysis of the Milan area, so we have a large database of passenger movements and an and we have a lot of experience previously acquired. We think that Milan can be used as a model for similar cities across European Union, both in terms of mobility and economic activity. In Italy, beginning from March 2020, all activities were closed due to COVID pandemic. People were forced to work from home, and this has created the condition of a stress test analysis, useful for evaluating and measuring the potential impact that working from home could have in terms of reducing urban traffic and fuel consumption and environment. We know that these represent an extreme and unfortunately unrepeatable situation, but data collected during this period are very important for potential estimate. Data used come from mobile device. In particular, every application installed on a mobile phone is able to identify the position of the mobile device. And all these data are collected. They can be used for many purposes, for commercial purpose, but also for research. This is why we acquired more than 35,000 data from users who live, work, or visit the city of Milan. All data were anonymized and aggregated, so no privacy law were broken. Period analyzed goes from February to March 2020. We divided this period in three parts. The first period is anti-COVID period. Then we have the period 1 COVID that starts when we had the closure of schools and university in Milan. But during this period there wasn't any lockdown, so people were allowed to go to work, but smart working was beginning to be encouraged. During period 2 COVID, there was the lockdown, so we have the ministerial decree that suspended of commercial activity except for necessary one, and the use of smart working was really encouraged. Okay, so this slide is very important. I hope to be clear. The target population has been divided between employed and unemployed. This was based on information in the anti-COVID period. All users who presented journey with the same starting point and destination every working day were classified as employed. We consider starting point the place of residence, and we consider destination the place where the user spend a minimum interval of a few hours every working days. So, under this criteria, students goes to the category of employed, and for example, a worker who doesn't work every day in the same place does not fit in this category. Urban movements have been categorized in systematic and occasional. Systematic movement take place with a repetition in the origin and destination every working day. All other movements are classified as occasional. We consider movement each journey from a starting point to an arrival point where the user stays more than 20 minutes. Under these criteria, for example, the movement to take the journey to take children to school, it's not classified as movement because the user doesn't spend there more than 20 minutes, usually. As I said before, we analyzed the Milan area, and our sample of users represents about 3% of the population. Thanks to the criteria shown in the previous slide, we divided users between employed and unemployed, and 69% of the sample belongs to the category identified as employed. This percentage can be compared to the global data relating to the population of Milan, and statistics show that 70% of the inhabitants of Milan belong to the employed category. On the basis of this, we can consider the sample our sample representative of the Milan population for this specific aspect. Also, acquired data have been discretized in 88 areas and grouped into 3 macro areas: the internal macrozone, the external macrozone, and the whole area outside the municipality. Okay, so we can see here some of the results. We have in this graph the number of movements in the 3 periods, the number of movements per day. So we have in the anti-COVID period about 7 million movements every working day, and in the period 1 COVID, this number decreased about 24.6%. In the second, in the period 2 COVID, total movements decreased about 55%. We can also see the decrease of occasional and systematic movement separately, and we can see that in the period 1 COVID, systematic and occasional movement decreased both about 24.67%, but in the period 2 COVID, occasional movement decreased more than systematic movements. So the stay-at-home requirement seems to have affected occasional trips more than systematic one. In order to estimate the maximum potential of reduction of the total movements due to smart working, we took the total movement in anti-COVID period, so which was that 7 million movements per day. So we have the preventive movement due to lockdown measure in period 2 COVID, that you can see in green in the graph, and it can be divided in prevented occasional movement and prevented systematic movement. In order to estimate the potential of smart working, we have to exclude from prevented systematic movement the share of those who remained at home without being able to work. To do this, we consider the number of employees per sector and the type of task affected by the closure obligation. So we were able to calculate the maximum potential of smart working that translates into potential reduction of total daily movement of 14.5%. On the basis of the maximum percentage shown in the previous slide, 2 scenarios were hypothesized. The first one, all workers that have the possibility use the smart working 2 days per week. Use smart working 3 days per week, with the assumption that 60% of the journey, of all journey in Milan area take place by car. This number comes from previous studies. We were able to calculate the avoid consumption due to car movement and the consequence on emission and pollutant, compared to that you can see in the table. Compared to the baseline case from the area of Milan, the use of smart working 2 days per week by all workers who have the possibility allowed to avoid 5% of total consumption and emission caused by car movement. And considering the use of smart working 3 days per week by all workers who have the possibility, the percentage rise to 8%. So in conclusion, smart working represents one of the actions that can be undertaken to optimize the mobility needs of population and reduce travel demand. We analyzed the city of Milan, and thanks to the data coming from the lockdown period, we had a decrease we had that smart working give a decrease in home workplace commutes, with consequence in terms of traffic and emission of pollutant. We could estimate a 5 or 8% of decrease in car fuel consumption and emission, with consequent environmental benefits. We should be noted two things. The first of all, that, as I said before, this is a maximum potential, so and it's a theoretical one. So, for example, no long-term changes in user behavior has been taken into account. Also, it has to be considered that smart working is complicated issues because the systematic home workplace movement affect various economic sectors. For example, catering, hotel activities, real estate market, commercial. So all these sectors are linked directly or indirectly to this type of mobility. So the widespread use of smart working can affect all these activities. So it has also be taken into account the effect of the effect on other economical activity that are important in a city. Okay, I hope you find this work interesting, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Francesca, for a very interesting start to the discussion. Please, if any of the delegates here have questions, please post them either in Zoom if you're in Zoom or on Hoover, and we'll attempt to ask Francesca about them. Perhaps I could just kick off, Francesca, with a question. Obviously, you found very positive impacts based on 2 or 3 days of home working in the context of Milan, both in terms of local emissions and CO2. Did you consider the longer term impacts if home working becomes embedded? What what other behavioural changes might happen, and whether that would be we would lose some of those shorter term impacts perhaps?
Okay, in this specific study, we analyzed only the period of lockdown during COVID pandemic, but we have acquired a lot of data, and so there are this study has great development potential because we can. Thanks to the data that we have acquired, we can track the behavior of the same user before and after the lockdown, and also during this year. So we can study more about long-term change in behavior with this new data. But this specific study was only about the lockdown. So in this specific potential, no long-term change of behavior is taken into account. But this is a development that we want to carry on. So maybe next year we will present a study about it.
Okay, we look forward to that, Francesca. The questions come through from Natalie Ortar. She says that some of the literature says that the decrease in commuting creates an increase in other types of mobility. Is that something you've been looking at, and is it something that you've been looking at, which is something that you seem to imply in your conclusion?
Okay, yeah. So because our data came from a very strange period, which is the lockdown, we couldn't be able to take into account the increase in other kind of mobilities, because during that period, no kind of mobility were allowed. So as I said before, this long-term change in behavior is under study, but this specific data couldn't allow to do this kind of analysis. because it was strictly about this kind of period. So no shopping center were open and restaurants were closed. So no other mobility was possible. But these kind of data, so mobile phone data, are very useful also to do this kind of analysis. So this is why we are deeply in this kind of analysis right now also.
Yeah, it's certainly an exceptional time to be doing this work. But one of your co-panelists, Bernardo, says fascinating data and work. How safe is it to assume that the sample is representative of Milan? Is there any information on the age distribution of the sample or any other factor which may be the basis of selection bias? For example, people using the app and people not using it.
Okay, with our kind of data, we don't have information about age or other information about the user. What we can and we did was to differentiate between employed and unemployed. And so we think that this kind of differentiation was representative of the Milan population, because we compared it to the statistics. So we were interested in this specific study only in this differentiation, and so we think that about this type is representative, but we didn't take into account our other type of characteristic like age or I don't know, type of mobility used before. We don't have this kind of information.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Francesca. I noticed we've got a couple more questions from Daniel and Dominique also in the chat, but I think they're relevant to the next presentation as well. So perhaps we'll try and pick those up in the discussion at the end, because I think it will be interesting to ask them of both presenters. So thank you for
all the questions. And okay, see you later.
Thank you, Francesca. Do come back at the end to join the debate.
Okay.
I'd like to welcome now Bernardo Calderon. Bernardo is working on his PhD in Science and Technology Studies at the Science Policy Research Unit, that's SPRU, at the University of Sussex. His research looks at the process of structural change in sub-Saharan Africa, with particular attention to the role of innovation, inclusion, and informality. He holds a research and teaching PhD scholarship awarded by the University of Sussex Business School. He's also worked for the Independent Office of Evaluation of the International Fund for Agriculture Development, that's IFAD, and was a visiting research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies working with the Rural Futures Cluster. I was interested to see that he also worked as a project manager for the NGO Joint, which is active in the field of capacity building for young people. So a great bio there, Bernardo. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Neil. We'll start sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see it. Okay, thanks for the nice introduction. My name is Bernardo Calderon, as it was mentioned. I'm presenting today work I've been conducting with Steve Sorrell at the Science Research Policy Unit within the CREDS, which is the Center for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. We have been looking at the historical impact of teleworking on English travel, focusing on the period between 2005 and 2019, so just like before the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So we'll try to see if there's any implication for the COVID, for the management of teleworking after the COVID pandemic. So our idea is that, of course, during the pandemic, but in general, teleworking is associated to a reduction in travel distance, at least anecdotally and intuitively. People travel less to work, and therefore they will save energy and emissions and miles traveled in going to work. However, we also noticed that there are a number of offsetting mechanisms to the savings induced by teleworking. So one of them is the dispersion of the residential location and longer commutes. This was found in a couple of papers who actually studied the increasing length of commutes of people who telework. This is often due to the fact that individuals or households where there is a teleworker may want to relocate farther from work to take advantage of the possibility of teleworking, of working from home. So people may decide to move away from the city center and relocate to a more rural area or a residential area in the outskirts of the city, relying on the fact that they will have to travel less, although for a longer one-way commute. The second mechanism is the induced non-work travel. So individuals who work from home may be induced to take more non-work trips like grocery shop or visiting friends and other things that people used to do on the way to work. So while going to work, I may pop at the shop and buy a couple of things, or may go and see some family or friends, and so on and so forth. So if you're at home and you're not going to work, then you will have to take your car or your bicycle or walk to the shop and buy some grocery or whatever you need to do. The third offsetting mechanism that may reduce the impact of teleworking on travel patterns are the intra-household dynamics. So there are also other papers who look at this effect, trying to study how individuals who don't go to work, so don't take their car to go to work, may free up resources to be used within the household, and therefore, in the end of the day, even if I'm not commuting, so I'm not going to work, someone else in the household may take up the car and go to work or go to school or anything else. So we try to take this into account when looking at the historical impact of teleworking on travel patterns in England. We do this using the following empirical framework. We try to estimate the effect of three groups of variables related to the land use of the household, so residential location factors, geographical factors. Then we look at socioeconomic characteristics of both households and individuals, so income, education, and a number of other controls. And then the factor which is of highest interest is teleworking. So how teleworking, while controlling for socioeconomic and land use factors, how it impacts travel patterns. How do we classify travel patterns? So we divide them into work travel patterns, or commuting, and non-work, which is a group of trips which are taken for things which are not related to work. We exclude at this stage business trips. We include escorting trips. We include grocery. We include any kind of commercial trips. We include healthcare, for instance, trips, any kind of trip that the individual or the aggregate, the household takes during their daily life. Pulled together, these two represent the total travel patterns of the household, and we exclude business trips, which we will study later, and I will show some interesting results on this. So when I will refer from now on about total travel, I will refer to work plus non-work trips, excluding business trips. Then we look at the mode in which the trip is taken. So we are able to divide between car trips, trips taken by public transport, active trips, so walking or cycling, and then pulling them all together. What data do we use? We use the UK National Travel Survey, which is an annual and stratified random sample survey of English households. It's quite large. There are around 14,000 individuals per year, for a total of around 240,000 trips per year. Unfortunately, the nature of these data is a pooled cross-section, so we don't have the same individuals interviewed year by year. However, there is always the national representative for each year. And this data is supplemented with transport emission factors. So we know which vehicles is used to take the trip, whether this is public transport or private transport. And this allows to match with emission factors. However, this data is stripped from the data set we're using for confidentiality issues. So we are in the process of getting this data from UK Data Service, and we hope to get it very soon. So for the time being, we look only at distance traveled rather than emissions. So this data includes also a 7-day trip diary, in which individuals report each and every trip they take over the week, over the past week, which is supposed to be the representative week. This information is available for each adult in the household. And this is comprehensive of many socioeconomic and demographic information, with one specific information, which is the frequency of working from home. Therefore, how many times individuals work from home. It's not discrete. It's not a continuous variable. It's a categorical variable. So we know that individuals work 3 times or more from home per week, or 1 or 2 times, less than 1 times, and so on and so forth. But it's not a regular continuous case. So from this data, we construct a subsample, which is the sample of interest, which is the sample of English commuters and their households. This sample is divided into 1 worker households and 2 worker households, and we use it to estimate weekly travel as a function of the frequency of working from home plus a number of controls. We decide to use only 3 categories of teleworking. So we take the teleworking variable, we group it into high frequency teleworkers, so those that work from home 3 or more times a week, medium frequency teleworkers, those working once or twice a week. And then all the others, we consider them non-teleworkers. So if individuals work from home less than once per week, then we don't consider them teleworkers, but only as occasional people who work from home for any reason. We exclude weekend trips, evenings, holidays, partial day, etc. So anything that may create noise into our representation of travel patterns. We also exclude individuals who have very particular travel patterns, like agricultural workers, fishing workers, forestry and mining workers, which are primary sector workers in general. And then we exclude all individuals and households that report 0 commuting distance. This is because we really want to look at the sample of commuters. So provided that you commute, that your job implies commuting, then we want to see how teleworking can reduce the distance travel at the individual and at the household level. So the estimation is quite simple. It's a very simple model, an OLS model at this stage. It's a model in semi-elasticity. So we have the log of the distance on the left hand of the equation, and on the right hand of the equation, we have teleworking, we have the socioeconomic factors, and time dummies. So we run many estimates. So in the end, we have a lot of models estimated because we break down the dependent variable into work distance, non-work distance, total distance, and business. Then we repeat the estimation, breaking the sample into 1 worker households and 2 worker households. We look also at the effect of a partner being a teleworker. So how does that induce increased travels or not? Then we have estimations for the individual and estimation for the household, which is the main point of this paper. We really try to see whether what we observe to happen in terms of reduction or increase in distance traveled at the individual level, whether this is reflected also at the household level. And then, of course, we break it down by mode, as I mentioned earlier, car, public, active, and all modes. So a quick set of facts about teleworking in England. This is the trend of teleworking between 2005 and 2019. As you can see, at the latest point of data collection, we have around 7.5% of individuals who are teleworkers over the total population. This is a tiny amount of the population. Medium frequency teleworkers have been increasing steadily over time with highs and bumps, but there's been definitely an increase in absolute values. There's been also an increase for high frequency teleworkers, but much less, and they represent nowadays around 1% of the population. Again, a very small amount of individuals. Teleworkers tend to be managers, professionals, people with higher income, people with higher education qualifications, people who work in the education or the real estate sector, and people who live in the London and Southeast area. These are important things to bear in mind when we think about the possible policy implication of encouraging teleworking. Second fact, this kind of proves the hypothesis that doesn't really prove it, because the direction of causality is still to be explored. But what we see here is that as teleworking frequency increases over time, so does the mean one-way commute. So the more frequently people telework, the farther they live from the workplace. Now, it's hard to tell whether people have relocated as a consequence of being allowed to telework, or people who live farther from the workplace are more likely to telework and they choose a job where they are allowed to telework. We will try to address this in a later stage with a structural equation modeling, trying to model this endogeneity, but this is a fact for the time being. We know that individuals who telework more frequently live farther from work. So their one-way commute on average is longer than other cases. This is especially true for medium frequency teleworkers, a bit less true for for high frequency teleworkers. Third fact, which is also interesting, this shows the proportion or the aggregate values of total commuting distance in miles in the sample. Central column indicates total non-work distance, and the brown one indicates total business distance. So as you can see, well, we may look at the effect of teleworking on commuting distance, but we would look only at a part of the picture. In aggregate, non-work trips exceed the distance traveled for commuting trips at the aggregate level. So we will look at this too. I will present now the results of the estimation very quickly. To make the long story very short, individual savings from teleworking are there, we observe them, but these are offset within the household. And the table shows in detail how this happens. So when we estimate the model I showed before for commuting distance, we see that medium frequency teleworkers tend to increase by 10.94% the distance with respect the commuting distance with respect to non-teleworkers. However, high frequency teleworkers tend to reduce it by 20%, which is great. I mean, it means that despite the fact that high frequency teleworkers live farther from work, in aggregate they tend to travel less. For non-work distance, we find that medium frequency teleworkers are increasing of 12, almost 13% of the distance with respect to non-teleworkers, but the effect for high frequency teleworkers is not statistically significant. So there are some savings overall for high frequency teleworkers, definitely not for medium frequency teleworkers, which means that for medium frequency teleworkers, the fact that they live farther from work implies an increase overall and on average of the travel distance. So red means an increase, green means a decrease. Decrease is good, increase is bad. If we look at the households in which these teleworkers work and we take into account the aggregate travel in those households, we see that all we have is an increase for medium frequency teleworkers in the total household distance traveled for commuting, non-work, and in total. And the reductions that we see here are actually not statistically significant. So these coefficients are statistically identical to 0. Okay, then we repeat the estimation also for one worker and two worker households. We divide it by travel mode. So we have total distance in this case by all modes, car, public, and active. So something I wanted to show, if we pull all the households together, so one worker household and two worker households, in the case of cars especially, we see that medium frequency teleworkers have non-statistically significant increase on travel distance, which is great news, and high frequency teleworkers have statistically significant decrease of 9.44% in the distance traveled in total. This is great news. Again, we expected to see something at the individual level. However, when we look at the household level, this effect that I showed before is dissipated. Okay, so we have an increase for medium frequency teleworkers for their households, and we don't have any effect for high frequency teleworkers. So at the aggregate level, at the household level, all we have is an increase in distance traveled. Okay, so to conclude, what we find is that historically teleworking is associated with more travel, especially in the case of medium frequency teleworkers. They have more travel than non-teleworkers, which is a strong evidence for the rebound effect or for the offsetting effect I was introducing in the beginning. High frequency teleworkers tend to travel less at the individual level, but these savings are offset at the household level. So there is some evidence for an hypothesis which we will try to explore more, which is that if I'm not traveling, if I'm not using my car because I'm teleworking, I'm freeing up resources that will be used by someone else within the household. Now, in relation with COVID, it's a bit complicated to see whether this trend will hold for the simple reason that after COVID-19, we will have lots of new teleworkers who may have completely different social demographic characteristics, and without panel data, it's very, very hard to estimate an unbiased coefficient of the effect of teleworking on travel distance. The implication, very quickly, is that if we encourage teleworking, then we should try also to avoid at the same time residential dispersal and encourage these high density and mixed use neighborhoods, so that if I need to go to the doctor or if I need to go to the grocery shop, I can go there walking rather than taking up my car, and therefore I don't offset the benefits of traveling less as a result of reduced commuted distance. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation indeed, Bernardo. Please, everybody, put your questions in the chat or on Hoover. Somewhat depressing, Bernardo, perhaps, given the optimistic hopes we perhaps have about the impacts of lockdown and the pandemic in terms of increasing home working. I mean, obviously, your data doesn't really include impacts of the pandemic because it's pretty much pre-lockdown, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So actually the NPS wasn't collected in 2020 as a result of the pandemic, because they used to go to people's houses and give the survey and get the household to fill the survey. So the year 2020 has been skipped entirely by UK Data Service, which is not great news. Hopefully we will have data in 2021, and at least we will be able to see how at the national level travel patterns have changed as a result of the pandemic. Now, it would be also interesting to see how hysteric this process is. So how this exogenous shock, the COVID-19, will hold up over the next couple of years. And I mean, we have no crystal ball. It's very hard to tell at this stage. But what these analysis, I think, shows is that there are complexities and nestedness in human phenomena which need to be taken into account. Looking at individual savings won't really tell the full story, because when people change their habits as a result of something new like teleworking, they will change all their habits. They may decide to sell their car, or they may decide to just give their car to someone else. And if I pass my car to someone else who didn't have one just because of lack of resources, then I'm not really reducing the impact of my car because someone else is using it. So it's hard to take all these things into account, but it's fundamental to bear in mind how complex people's lives are, and therefore how changing their habits may have a trickle-down effect onto also the household dynamic.
Yeah, as you say, many different factors to consider. You talked about high frequency and medium frequency teleworkers, and there was sort of a glimmer of optimism, if you like, in terms of high frequency. Can you just remind me how you categorize medium and high? What's the boundary between those two in terms of days per week home working?
Yeah, so high frequency teleworkers are teleworkers working for 3 or more times a week from home, and these amount to 1% of the English population. And then medium frequency teleworkers are those working 1 or twice a week, and this is around 6% of the total English population. So before COVID, teleworking wasn't the rule, it was more an exception. And what we will try to do in the next step is to estimate the impact on emissions of what we have observed so far, and then try to model future scenarios and see if we increase high frequency teleworkers by how much, what will be the effect on carbon emissions. Again, aggregate figures may not be super accurate, so we will try to give something more granular in terms of the impact of reduction on emissions.
Thank you, Bernardo. We're running a bit behind. Unless you have a question, Dražen, I think we'll move on and we can come back to questions at the end and discussion, because the first 2 papers have a lot of common themes, and it'd be interesting to compare and contrast perhaps. So thank you very much, Bernardo. Very interesting presentation indeed, and a paper that's well worth reading. Next up is Emma Cassar. Emma's a PhD researcher at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at the University of East Anglia in the UK. Emma's research focuses on the diffusion of low carbon innovations in the transport sector, and forms a part of a European Research Council project called Social Influence and Disruptive Low Carbon Innovations. It's got the great acronym of SILCI. Prior to starting a PhD, Emma worked as an environmental scientist at an environmental consultancy in Malta, providing technical expertise in European funded projects. So Emma, it's all yours. Thank you very much.
So hello everyone, my name is Emma and I'll be presenting a few findings from my recent study which forms part of my PhD. So my research focuses on students transitioning from the university to the workplace. Research has shown students attending university use sustainable modes of transport, which are mostly walking or public transport. The reasons are because of income and because students relocate close to their university, so they are within walking distance to their campus. This repetitive behavior within a stable context becomes a routine for students, which then becomes a habit. Now, this stable context of traveling to campus becomes disrupted as students graduate and leave university to start their graduate job. This disruption is known as the habit discontinuity hypothesis, and research has shown that certain life events such as relocation or changing job or even having a child act as windows of opportunity, where previous habits become weakened and new habits can be formed. So in the study, the transition from university to the world of work acts as a window of opportunity. And because of this, we question, how can we sustain university graduates' sustainable commute patterns as they transition into the workplace, given that this is a window of opportunity and is important because studies have shown how once students find a stable full-time job, they are more likely to purchase a car and start driving. So the objectives of the study are basically to identify the factors that motivate and influence university graduates' choice of commute when they were at university and now as employees. And we also explore this new evolutionary concept in the transport sector, which is known as mobility as a service, as a potential tool. Now, to explain mobility as a service, it is a smartphone app which combines different modes of transport into a digital platform, and one can access these services through a subscription payment. So depending on how much you pay, you would get limited or unlimited services available. Now, the aim of MOS is to be user-centric, and therefore the app would be intelligent enough to know the user's travel needs and create a mobility package specific to that user. So having such an app which combines all different modes of transport, mainly public transport and shared mobility services such as car sharing or ride sharing and taxis, into a single subscription can support students in using sustainable modes of travel, especially since young adults are more confident using smartphone technology and are more open to use different types of transport modes. So the study is focused on the West Midlands, where Transport for West Midlands operates rail, bus and tram lines across the area. Now in our study, we also include questions about the Clean Air Zone, which was launched last week, and basically it requires drivers of other cars, vans and trucks to pay a daily fee to enter the city centre. In addition to the Clean Air Zone, a traffic access initiative is also being implemented, which means that the city centre is segmented into different sections where only public transport can drive through segments, and personal vehicles will have to turn around and enter different segments using the outside ring road. So to explore the factors that motivate and influence university graduates' choice of commute, we use the capability, opportunity, motivation, behavior model found within the behavior change wheel. Now, the model recognizes that an individual's behavior is a function of their capability, opportunity, and motivation to engage in that particular behavior. The wheel also helps researchers identify intervention functions and policy categories to address and implement behavior change. So we conducted semi-structured interviews with 27 participants who graduated from a UK university within the last 3 years and were living and working in the West Midlands. We had 3 participants who were mature students with an average age of 35 and lived in a household with young children, and the remaining 24 participants with an average age of 24 lived in a household without children. So the transcriptions and notes were thematically analyzed, and we used the theoretical domains framework as a coding framing to create subthemes within each domain. So because of time, I will be presenting one result for each of the 2 target behaviors. As I explained, the target behaviors in our study are the use of public transport and shared mobility services and the potential use of MOS. I'm going to explain these results in the next slides. However, I'm also presenting a few other domains which were found important. So we have beliefs about capabilities, knowledge, and social influences, which were found as key domains influencing the behavior of using public transport and shared mobility services. And domains influencing the potential use of MOS were social, professional role and identity, optimism, and reinforcement. So the key domain influencing the use of public transport and shared mobility services, we have the environmental context and resources, which basically asks to what extent do physical or resource factors facilitate or hinder the use of these services. Some of the influential factors were the availability of safe bicycle lanes and shower facilities at work would help participants choose to cycle. Having parking fees and lack of parking spaces make participants opt for public transport modes or even car sharing measures so that they can split the costs. Participants find having to switch from one transport mode to another because there are no direct routes is basically unpleasant, and therefore they tend to travel using their private car. And finally, having travel restriction policies would influence participants' use of a private car, because for example, the traffic cells initiative, which some participants found it complicated for them. So knowing that this is complicated, it makes them rethink of how next time they would need to travel to the city center. So the second target behavior of using mobility as a service is mostly related to the functionality of the app. So participants said that the app would need to be easy to use with live travel time updates and options for when, for instance, the train is delayed and someone is pressed for time, they need to get to work on a certain time or they have an interview. Also the cost of the app. So the cost of using the app would need to be competitive with other existing travel plans. And it should also have different subscription plans so that it can appeal to different types of commuters. And having a policy such as the traffic cells initiative, which restricts driving a car across the city center, makes an app like MOS more appealing, as participants have seen this as it would help them navigate public transport better and therefore help them save travel time. So following these results, we've put them in a table and identified the right intervention function for each domain. So the intervention function is linked to the domain of environmental resources and context. We find training, so the importance of imparting skills through providing information on how to use public transport at schools and residents in the area, including experience of using public transport and shared mobility services. We did find some of our participants did lack experience. So the participants who were less confident of using public transport is because of their lack of experience. Another intervention function is restriction. So basically restriction means using rules to increase the target behavior by reducing the opportunity to engage in competing behaviors. And this is exampled by the traffic cells initiative, which basically restricts driving car through segments of the city center. So as an example, it's prohibiting car use in city centers, and also car use policy at the workplace would actually help. And another intervention function is environmental structuring, which means changing the physical or social context. And this can be done through the better urban management of spaces, having less parking spaces and maybe more recreational areas, and possibly having safe cycle lanes with direct routes into the workplace. In fact, one of our participants did mention how she cycles to work, and it's because she has a cycle path from her home directly to her workplace. So that makes it easier for her. So the interviews took place in February of this year, and here I'm presenting a few thoughts on the impact that COVID-19 had on the participants' type of commute. So participants were actually discouraged from using public transport because of social distancing measures and government advice also to avoid using public transport and make unnecessary trips. However, participants who actually had to use public transport said they had a great experience overall. It was a very positive experience using public transport because they could find available seats, there was enough space to social distance from other passengers, And also their journey was quieter compared to the more busy commute that they used to have pre-COVID. We actually only had one participant who switched from public transport to their personal car, and this was because their workplace gave free parking spaces within the company's car park, which usually was reserved to managers. And also participants who continued to drive to work during COVID found their commute journey time to be relatively short because there was no congestion on the road. And finally, only one participant. So one participant made a comment which was interesting, and they said that COVID had brought about the importance of having digitized tickets on public transport. And therefore, they saw this as this could speed up the adoption of MOS when it might be implemented. So I'll finish with a few main points from the behavioral analysis. And basically, because of time, I could not present everything, but these are a few takeaway points from the study. So in terms of knowledge, all participants showed good knowledge of the available public transport modes and transport services, and those who use public transport to commute said the availability of these services close to their place of work made it easier for them to travel by public transport. We also found work location and the nature of the job limits participants' choice of transport modes. So people who have to travel to agricultural areas or rural areas, obviously it's much more difficult for them to use public transport because the service is not available at their place of work. We had 7 participants who did not have a driving license, but all of them claimed that they would get a driving license if their job requires them to. Also, we found that the negative experience of public transport during university has triggered some of the participants to get driving license and start driving. This was mainly seen in participants who had work placements as part of their university degree. So they had experience of using public transport for their work placements. They found out that it does not work, and so they decided that they need a driving license and a car for when they actually start their full-time job. So overall, to conclude, the potential for MOS is positive. All participants found MOS to be interesting and worth trying, except for participants whose nature of their job limits them from using public transport. The issue of delays and cost were the most talked about factors, and therefore with the right social support and assurance of journey timings, that there are no delays or there are replacements, university graduates would be willing to shift towards more sustainable modes of transport. And that's it from my end. Thank you for listening, and I will take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for a very interesting and succinct presentation. Obviously, it's going to be a devil of a job to get people back on public transport after what we've been through. But actually, I thought, you know, your presentation actually offered some glimmers of hope in terms of the experience of people, you know, during it, in that, you know, they've had, you know, space to travel. And they've actually, you know, enjoyed the experience. I was just interested to know whether, from your researches, it was clearly a reduction in overall travel, but was there a similarly proportionate reduction in public travel compared with private travel, or did you get that data?
So yes, so there was in fact another question in the survey, in fact, during the interviews, where I asked participants if, so the ones that use their car to go shopping and leisure activities, etc., it did say that actually during COVID, they did reduce their amount of car. So for example, if they used to go maybe every day to the supermarket, they just go once a week to the supermarket. So the reduction in car, moving forward, they do think of replacing it, or maybe if they have 2 cars, they get rid of 1 car because they don't find it useful anymore if they continue also working from home. So there is a bit of, obviously the situation is very fluid as well. So it depends on in the next few months, or maybe later on, we will know what the results will be. But it was very interesting to see that the respondents were very open to using public transport, and also having this positive experience of using it when not many people were using it. It made them think even more that they can use it. So yeah, there are positive things, but obviously COVID the way it is, because it's about health, and these participants, they're moving forward into having families as well, so it can then all change. So yeah.
It's obviously been, the mother of all disruptions, if you like. Just based on your studies, what would you say were the most effective sort of interventions? If you were a policymaker in the West Midlands, what would you be doing to accelerate mass uptake and the adoption of more desirable travel behaviour by this constituency?
Yes, so it was interesting when participants were talking about the cleaner zone and the traffic sales initiative. Obviously, you'll have negative comments, but many of them did have positive reviews and saying that we need this. And even one of them said it's a necessary evil, basically, because otherwise they need a push so that they can commute differently. But one of the things which needs to, and I think someone mentioned the encouragement of basically high density neighborhoods as well. So many of these participants mentioned that they would want to relocate close to their work and close to anything that they can walk to. And so that they do not have to rely on public transport or a car. So one of the things also which MAS needs to look at is the flexibility as well. So I'm going to move on to something which I don't know if it's been mentioned, but there are different types of people who work. So sometimes policies are about the regular worker from 9 to 5, and that's it. But actually nowadays we have different types of workers, different types of shifts. So it needs to be, any policy needs to be flexible and work around different types of workers as well.
Thanks, Emma. We've got a question from a panelist, sorry, not a panelist, from a delegate, from Daniel Kerr. So how does the MAS app interact with transport service operators, for example, Travel West Midlands? Will there be, for example, ticketing integration for buses?
Yes, so the way it works is actually a MAS operator will have control over different types of transport modes. So even if they're from different companies, they can come together. Obviously, this is one of the problems that we're facing. So for example, in Finland, the MAS app, WIM, it is functional and it works. It's because by law, all the different transport operators need to share their data. So sharing of data is one of the problems, which is actually acting as a barrier for now for MAS not to be implemented and cannot work. It will only work with an operator who has different types of transport modes. So if they have control over the bus, train, and rail, so if it's the same company, then yes. And in fact, in the West Midlands, there is something called the Swift card, which includes the bus, the rail, and the tram. But obviously then MAS opens up because it also involves Uber and taxis and also electric scooters and bike sharing. So all the transport modes into just one subscription payment. So yeah, so that is something which actually there are studies also being conducted on how to put all the operators together, and they would obviously need to share their data. And there's also a business model which needs to be worked on as well.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Emma. We need to move on because we're running a little bit short of time, but thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Now, last but certainly not least, Amélie Ancio. Amélie holds a PhD in sociology, obtained in 2020 from the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. Her thesis focused on the way in which sustainable practices appear, are maintained or are abandoned, as well as on their coexistence with other less green practices. The main themes of this research are food, mobility, and tourism. Currently, Amélie is working as a postdoctoral project assistant on a project that aims to reduce the energy consumption of households in Brussels. So Amélie, over to you.
Hello everybody, my name is Amélie Ancio. I'm a sociologist and I have just defended a doctoral thesis on the adoption of sustainable practices. Today, in collaboration with my colleague Julie Castreman, I would like to present a reflection on the basis of quantitative survey carried out as part of the master thesis of Julie and the mixed data of my research. Also, I would like to apologize for my colleague Julie, who has taken a complementary master's degree and who is currently taking an exam. So, the questions that links Julie's works and mine is the following. Why is automobilism still a popular practice when everyone knows its very negative impact on the environment? Indeed, in Europe and Canada, car is the most popular mode of transport. However, transportation is responsible for nearly 30% of the European Union's CO2 emission, and private cars account for 60% of the total emissions. In Quebec, owning a car in a household represents the second largest expense after housing and before food, meaning that more than 20% of household income is spent on road transport. In the same time, numerous studies have shown that awareness raising, information and education are not sufficiently effective levers to enable the adoption of concrete practices with a lower environmental impact. So, how can we understand the continuing success of automobilism? To answer these questions, Julie and I took social practice theories as a framework for analysis. The particularity of this line of thought is that it considers the practice as the unit of analysis and not the individual, as it's generally the case. We will come back to this later in the presentation. Concerning the methodology, we will base our results on quantitative and qualitative data obtained from 3 separate researches carried out either in Canada or in Belgium. Wallonia and Montreal have been chosen for their heterogeneous characteristics. In these 2 case studies are distinguished by their population density, 890 inhabitants per square kilometer for Montreal versus 215 inhabitants per square kilometer for Wallonia, as well as by the urban character of Montreal versus the semi-urban characters of Wallonia. Furthermore, it should be noted that these 2 regions cannot be compared as such, as the data collected are of different natures. There is no qualitative data for Quebec, and the questionnaires are different between the 2 study regions. Nevertheless, combining the data from these 2 areas is still relevant because it allows us to identify some clear trends, regardless the location, that influence or limit the adoption of mode of transport with a lower environmental impact. In social practice theories, practice is considered as the unit of analysis and is defined as a temporally unfolding and spatially dispersed nexus of doings and sayings. From there, that skill is various components of the practice, know-how and routine, institutionalized procedures, and teleoaffective structures. Requits as a 4th component, technologies and physical structures. All of these components are necessary for the practice to take place. Some components can be seen as levers encouraging the practice to take place, or on the contrary, as brakes. This is what we will see in the following slides. The first component of any practice is how-know and routines. About accelerators concerning how-know and routines, it is good to know that car use allow the realization and the coordination of many social activities. The results show that driving allows practitioners to go to work, to carry out domestic activities such as shopping or administrative tasks, to go to place of leisure, and to engage in socializing activities. Automobilism can also allow for practice for others, such as running errands while the partners ride a bike to and from work or dropping off the children somewhere. Nevertheless, the breaks in these sections show that the proximity, a lack of physical or driving skills, or the adoption of another mode of transport since childhood could limit car use. Here, the quote of Barbara allows us to highlight two obstacles to car use: the proximity and the lack of skills. Since Barbara does not provide the necessary driving skills, she cannot be recruited through this practice. Moreover, since she lives downtown, she can easily do without a car. A second component of practice is the teleaffective structures defined as the goals, objectives, project, and emotion. This component can promote or limit the use of the car. Representation associated with the car, such as autonomy, comfort, the feeling of freedom, a break for oneself, stabilize the use of the car. In addition, representation associated with other modes of transport, such as inflexibility, loss of time, noise, insecurity, and now probably the risk of catching the virus, reinforce automobility. But automobility can also defect. 13% of Canadian respondents who have reduced their practice in the past 10 years have done so for environmental reasons. Proportionally, respondents who wish to do without their car consider visual and atmospheric pollution to be disadvantage of automobile more than the others. Then, respondents who want to do without their car are more likely to believe that citizens are the main responsible of climate change in the way they consume. Material arrangements are a third component and are defined as object, infrastructures, tool, equipment, and the body itself. Via material arrangement, automobility may be encouraged or inhibited. About accelerators, the road network represents 9.5% of Montreal's territory, but can go up to 30% in some municipalities. The Wallon Road network is among the densest in Europe, so that Belgian car has a network 48 times denser than the Belgian train. Depending on where you live, the accessibility of alternative varies, as the code shows. Inversely, in Montreal, as in Wallonia, motorists who wish to divest themselves of their vehicle are proportionally and very significantly more likely to consider the following as disadvantage of the car: price, congestion, difficulty of parking, noise, and the price of parking. This means that some material arrangement may also disadvantage the car use. Finally, the last component is that of institutionalized procedures. Institutionalized procedures act as a backdrop to the adoption of mobility practices, whether or not they have a lower impact on the environment. For example, in Belgium and Quebec, government spending continues to increase in the transport sector despite budget cuts in other sectors such as health, culture, etc. Between 1995 and 2015, Canada's government spending grew 69% for road improvement. In Wallonia, in 2017, 600 million has been earmarked for highway lighting, compared with 72 million to help purchase electric bicycles. This massive investment in road infrastructures make automobile transport useful and beneficial, which is a power that contributes to maintain the use of the car. Moreover, in Belgium, 1 in 10 car is a company car or a salary car. On the contrary, other measures can curb car use. In Belgium, since February 2009, all private companies must contribute 75% of the cost of transport between home and work if the journeys are made by public transport. At the same time, various measures have been put in place to encourage carpooling or use of electric bikes. In conclusion, we can argue that the results obtained in Montreal and in Wallonia are relatively similar. Indeed, we note that the accelerators favoring automobility are more numerous and stronger than the brakes related to this practice. Indeed, while trip-timing, urban sprawl, social distinction related to the use of the car, and policies for the development of motorized roads are realities, the construction of eco-neighbor roads, the accessibility and efficiency of alternative mode of transport outside the city center, the development of new social norms favorable to green mobility and subsidies for alternative mode of transport remain anecdotal. This analysis by the component of practice show that contemporary realities are a set of dimensions that continue to encourage the practice of automobility. Analysis by the component of the practice also show that environmental sensitivity is insufficient to allow the adoption of a mode of transport with a lower environmental impact. Stopping taking the car every day is therefore beyond the individual's controls, but requires a rethinking of current social, political, economic, and geographic realities. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to discussing it with you.
Hi, Emily, thank you very much indeed for that. Looking at your last chart, I noticed that there were sort of rather more accelerators than brakes in the list, but of course they may weigh differently. But I just wonder what you'd say about what are the, in terms of where we are currently, you know, it would seem to me that the accelerators are currently outweighing the brakes, but what are the key things we could do to shift that balance? So that automobility is on the decline rather than continue to rise.
Okay, thank you for your question. It's a big question, and I'm not sure if I have all the answer, but I have some way to discuss. So I think that the key points of this research is to find the solution with the different way, so the different component of the practice. So just the politics impacts is not enough. So just decided some rule from the government, for example, is not especially enough. You need more thing like material arrangement, for example, to increase the public transportation, for example, in the city center, but also in the countryside, because some people have some very environmental sensitivity, but they have no choice to use the car because they live in the countryside and there is no public transport. So there is no choice. They have to take their car to go to work. So I think that there is the solution is divided in different factors, and all of these factors have to take into account. So yeah, that's one of my answers.
Thank you. I agree, a difficult question. I couldn't answer it, but automobilism, I'm not, in terms of its definition, is shared use of a car, is that also automobilism?
Yeah, because I think that there is, in my comprehension, yes, automobilism is also carpooling or car sharing, but because they are also autosolism, and the autosolism is a concept to define the use of the car individually. So yeah, I think that yeah, and the automobilism and is different of the automobility, because the automobility is the fact to to go to move to have the mobility, but you can use the car, or you can use the public transport, or you can use a bike. So there is different concept, but in my acceptation, yes, carpooling and car sharing are automobilism too.
A comment from Natalie Ortar. It's a comment rather than a question, I think, but you might have a response. Some of the accelerators for car, such as pleasure, time for oneself, staying in the same mode, is something you also find in other modes such as cycling, public transport, etc. More comparison between transportation mode adoption seems to be needed.
Okay, yeah, it's a good remark, and yes, I think that the need is to compare the different practice, the mobility practice, like to use the bike, to bicycle, to use the car, because some of accelerator for car could be the brake for other mode of transport. In the interview, for example, one guy said that he didn't want to use a bike to go to work because in the public transport, for example, he can check his email and answer to his email, but if he use the bike, he cannot do this. So yes, a comparative research between the different practice of mobility is another, maybe a different research, but also very important and interesting. Yeah.
Yes, it's certainly not to be advised, checking your email on a bicycle. We've got just under 10 minutes left, so perhaps other speakers could put their cameras on and we can have a bit of a more general discussion, and you may indeed have questions for each other. I've just sort of got one thought to kick off, which relates, I think, to what we've just been hearing, actually from both Emma and Amelie. What do each of you think, perhaps from your own different perspectives, what the impacts in terms of the aftermath of the pandemic and more home working and all the lockdown, all that stuff might have on car ownership, and the desire in particular perhaps of young people to own a car? I don't know who would like to kick off on that, but what this disruption is going to mean in terms of car ownership, and perhaps what we might do to to pin down some of the advantages that might be there if we take certain actions.
Question is for me. I'm not sure. I did my interview before the pandemic, and my research done just before the COVID-19. So I don't have more information with these interviewees and with this young adult, but yeah, it would be interesting to do more interview, because mobility practice have evolved during the pandemic. I know I can make some supposition, but I have no real data to work on it. So yeah. I
mean, to use your language, Emily, we have accelerators and brakes in terms of the answer to that question. Obviously, I mean, there's resistance to using public transport because of fear of catching the virus, but hopefully that will die down. Perhaps on the other side, if people live more at home, there's more home working, we develop more 50-minute neighborhoods, perhaps there's less need for the use of a car. So I don't know if any of you would like to pick up on any of those thoughts and perhaps suggest some of the things, perhaps for policymakers as well, what we should be doing at this point.
Something which I found, so like I said, the interviews I did were in February, so during the pandemic. Some of the respondents actually did say that before the pandemic, they used to live somewhere else. And because of what happened, they moved closer to their place of work or closer to their family, or basically started living with their family, so went back. But definitely there was this idea, so similar, it was very interesting because it's similar to when you start university, you move close to your university and close to campus. The same participants saw that if they did the same with their workplace, it would be much more easier for them. And then they remarked that if they wanted to go out, what they usually do is always find Uber or taxis because when they're going out, they're drinking. So there's no sense in having a car. They only use their car to just go for grocery shopping or maybe visit friends. But nevertheless, one other thing which I didn't mention in my presentation is car sharing. So when participants were students, they car shared a lot because they car shared with their housemates, with their friends. But when they started working, car sharing did not come into the picture because the reasons they said was they didn't know if they lived close to someone who they can car share with, or because of strangers, they don't want to car share with strangers. But nevertheless, they do want to car share if there's the opportunity because they would split the cost and it wouldn't be that expensive for them. And in terms of the workplace, if the workplace does encourage, for example, there's a cycle to work scheme. Many participants know about this, but because they either live far away or because they don't have the facilities at work to shower, they do not choose this. So there's a lot of factors, and like what Emily said as well, there are different accelerators and breakers, and there are different factors from an intrinsic, like what people are capable of doing and the motivation as well. So yes, there are a lot of factors. Obviously, COVID made it much more complex and difficult now for us to research this. But obviously, it's very interesting to see how this is going to evolve.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I'd like to get back a little bit to teleworking. We have a couple of questions from earlier, but just before we finish on the sort of car ownership idea, I don't know if Bernardo or you, Francesca, have a view from your perspectives in terms of what the disruption we've been through and the increase potentially in home working might have in terms of car ownership and the desire to own a car?
Yeah, can I?
Go ahead.
I think the last presentation gave a nice prompt on understanding the issue of car ownership and the use of car in terms of seeing it as a practice. I would stress something which is not necessarily related to COVID. It's more like a general issue. I think there's a lot of blame shifting towards the consumer or the individual for wanting to own a car. Something that was said again by Emily in the last presentation was that car ownership is something which sometimes is beyond people's control. So we really have to think about the circumstances that bring people to decide to own a car, including cultural factors and practical factors. From where I'm from, if you turn 20 and you don't own a car, you failed. So, I mean, there's lots of changes that really need to come through to rethink the issue of car ownership. In terms of its savings, again, if we focus on what people decide to do as if they were completely free to buy a car or not, but they are bounded in the rationality when it comes to take a decision like this, well, it will be hard to give just a small incentive and expect habits to be radically changed. This process needs to be governed, and the complexity of these decisions needs to be acknowledged by policy and by regulators, because just reducing or increasing a carbon tax on buying a car won't really change the game. It will only exclude those that cannot afford it. And actually, we find that people with higher income tend to commute more for longer distance. So, I mean, it's a self-enforcing mechanism. We will only increase the divide in this sense. So, I really hope that this kind of, when we think about habits which are deeply entrenched into a society, we really have to think about the society as a whole and the practice as embedded into the society.
Thanks very much, Bernardo. Francesca, I don't know if you had anything to add, or shall I go on and ask you a question that relates to teleworking? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you can ask me another question. I agree.
Okay. Well, this may be for you or for anybody, but actually, I think it relates to the other panels as well. And it's a question really about working across disciplines, because it's from Dominique Osso, and it was asked earlier, I think after one of the first or the second presentation. So we've been talking about the impacts on mobility behaviour in terms of home working, but the question is about what is the impact on energy more broadly. Obviously we're using our own heating, lighting equipment at home, and I don't think either of your studies looked at that. So are you aware of any anything that looks at this more broadly in terms of the overall impact on energy use, be that transport or domestic energy or other?
Yeah, in our group, we are carrying on research on specifically on this aspect, because with smart working in office, they have less expenditure for energy, like for air conditioning. But otherwise, at home, you have more use of air conditioning or heating or electricity. So this is having a huge impact also on the objective of the energetic national plan, for example, because all the residential sector is becoming is consuming more, and so otherwise the tertiary sector is consuming less, but not due to energy efficiency, but due to a changing in user habits. So it has a huge smart working has a huge impact also on this aspect, because consumers are changing from the office to the home, but at home you don't know if you have an efficient air conditioning system or an efficiency boiler or whatever. So I think this is also a huge aspect that has to be taken into account.
Yeah, more research needed by the sound of it. Do any of the rest of you have any comments on that, so the broader impacts of energy use in terms of the shift to home working?
So our study doesn't really look into that, in the sense of looking at whether increased consumption at home offsets decreasing consumption in the office. But I think a really interesting avenue for further research is to bring together this kind of information, especially in a longitudinal way. So having information at the individual level and estimates of per capita consumption in offices and at home. At home it's easier with smart meters. This can be done, and there are already pioneering studies using smart meters to find out how consumption changes. This doesn't come without complications though, because people become the data generating machines, and they basically get interviewed a lot, and especially these communities using smart meters. There's lots of studies, qualitative and quantitative, being carried out, and I'm wary of how long this can last. Like, how can we still treat people having smart meters as open air laboratories? That's definitely the only way. I'm not aware of any easier way of collecting data other than surveying people.
No, perhaps there's a need for a cross-cutting study between panels for the next summer study. I realize we're a bit over time, but I've just got one great question from Rod Jansen for all of you, or any of you who are brave enough to pick it up. With COP26 coming up later in the year, based on your research, what would your top message be to the leaders or negotiators of in that discussion? Emma, you look as though you want to answer it.
It's just something which basically, if we look at COVID-19, it's disrupted a lot of our lives. And I think it's something which we need to work on and improve. I mean, we've seen studies have come out, we've seen lower in CO2 emissions from transport because of the lockdowns and people restricted from using their cars. So I think we should use that and move forward, basically, and take this COVID-19 as a disruption and a window of opportunity to improve on our mobility.
To get into better habits. Yeah. Anybody else want to pick up that challenge of what to say to the leaders?
Yeah, maybe a very quick one. Ban cars, or at least SUVs, because these cars tend to be like a tool for people with higher income to purchase their right to pollute. So as we see, there's a big association between income and pollution, at least when it comes to transport. People shouldn't be allowed to pollute more because they earn more. Same discourse for the carbon tax. I mean, you shouldn't be allowed to pollute just because you can afford to buy more carbon quotas.
I think that's a very clear message. Emily or Francesca, do you have a message for anybody who's going to be up there in Glasgow in a few months' time?
Oh, just really quickly, in the same way of my presentation, just not thinking about the big pictures and the different factors of the evolution of the practices. And I think that it's a good advice for the COP, maybe. And that's it.
Francesca, a last word, perhaps?
No, nothing comes into my mind. So it's okay.
It's a tough one. We're over time. I've got a couple of reminders for people. In 10 minutes time, Paolo Bertoldi of the European Commission and Cedric Jeanneret of SIG are hosting an informal session. I should also remind you that in terms of panel 6, there's going to be, I think, a very interesting session on electrification tomorrow. So do come along to that. Thank you all very much indeed for some great presentations and some really good discussion, and see you around on this virtual platform for virtual drinks sometime. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.